Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined tonight via Skype by Roger Mullen, former MP and now the Director of Momentous Change. Roger, how are you?
I'm just grand, Kenny. Nice to be here.
Now, I have to stress, you're not coming in on Skype because you're self-isolating. You're just coming in on Skype because you couldn't get through to the studio this evening, isn't that right?
That's right. It's because I'm sitting here in my little office in Kirkcaldy.
Excellent. Well, our first story is on coronavirus. The number of positive cases of coronavirus in Scotland is 36 as of 2 p.m. today. There were 9 new cases announced today, including 1 case transmitted in the community. This is the first known community transmission of the virus in Scotland. Chief Medical Officer Catherine Calderwood said, "We have identified the first case of community transmission in Scotland which is unrelated to contact or travel. This was identified through our enhanced surveillance scheme. It's important to emphasise that we are still in the containment phase. This case was to be expected and highlights the importance of the additional measures we have put in place to identify positive cases beyond self-identification." Tory Health Minister Nadine Dorries MP also reported yesterday that she is now in isolation at home after being diagnosed with the virus. This raises significant concerns about transmission both within the Westminster Parliament and the Department of Health, which both need to be functioning effectively to properly manage the spread of the virus. Also in Scotland, local authorities are being encouraged to relax planning restrictions around delivery times and store opening hours to ensure supermarkets and other retailers are able to maintain stock levels during the current coronavirus outbreak. Local Government Minister Kevin Stewart and the Scottish Government's Chief Planner have jointly written to all planning authorities to encourage officials to relax planning restrictions while taking into account the needs and concerns of the wider community. Authorities have also been encouraged to exercise discretion in considering enforcement action against any breaches of planning conditions restricting delivery and opening times. Relaxing these restrictions will help to minimise potential disturbance to the local community and help ensure that increased demand for essential items can be met at a local level. And Roger, we were just saying just before we came on air there, it's not an easy thing to manage a viral outbreak like this. What do you think of the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government's reaction to the outbreak so far?
I think compared with many other countries in the world, the reaction so far has been, on the whole, pretty good. And indeed, I think there's every evidence that what they're doing is listening to the science, listening to the professional community, which I think is far better than you would see happening, for example, in the United States, where it still seems to be driven in part by the mere populism of Donald Trump and the like. So I think from that point of view, throughout the UK and in Scotland, it has been good. I think, of course, one of the key things is how this is going to develop. It's obviously of concern that things begin to get transferred, the virus getting transferred within a community, because that means it's being passed from person to person within Scotland, not simply external. And of course, that is what was expected, but nonetheless raises much more the concerns people have that everybody, including everybody listening to this broadcast, are taking all reasonable measures. I know, for example, like myself, and know that you, Kenny, I'm washing my hands far more frequently and far more thoroughly than I would typically have done. And I think people have got to do that.
Yeah. Speaking of the response of government, though, as I said, Nadine Dorries has been infected. Now, obviously, she'll have been through the lobbies with many other members of Parliament. She'll also, as a health minister, have been in touch with people in the Department of Health. There's obviously then a significant risk that there are other cases in there. What's your thoughts about how Parliament might manage this if people are going to be advised to self-isolate?
I would certainly hope that there's a proper investigation ongoing into what meetings she had over the last number of days, how many people she was in contact with, shaking their hands and the like. And I know that in terms of Parliament as a whole, the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle, has got some responsibility here. So I would hope that the Speaker has been encouraging the government to really look at what contacts have been made. In that regard, I'm slightly surprised that there's only one other MP who's chosen to go into self-isolation, because I would have thought, like any minister, they're having very, very frequent meetings. In terms of your wider point, which I think is well made about the concerns in the NHS, part of the problem here, of course, is that NHS workers out in the hospitals and doctors' surgeries and the like, they're in daily contact with people who are ill. They're much more exposed to risk than many others in the community. So I think this is something that, there has to be very clear intelligence on a day-by-day basis kept about who's in contact with whom, what the consequences are, and the like.
Yeah, we heard Jeane Freeman say today that they expect between 20 and 30% of NHS staff to be off sick over the course of this outbreak. Do you think the NHS is able to cope with that? Well,
my understanding is, first of all, nobody knows exactly how many are going to be. What the government have got to do is set up contingency plans, assuming a bad case. So that's a bad case scenario. We would hope that by preventative measures, and if everybody does the right thing, it might be contained to a smaller number. But they've got to plan for that kind of number. If that sort of number was to arise, then I think there is huge strain going to be put on the NHS. Personally, I think it will mean that there would have to be cancellation of quite a lot of routine matters, routine operations and the like, so that a priority can be given to coping with the coronavirus outbreak. But it will have big consequences for the strain in the NHS, particularly, of course, at this time in the year, because we're not fully through the regular flu period either. That hasn't quite come to an end yet. So there's considerable demand and considerable concerns.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as you say, that is a worst case scenario. We can only hope that the planning and everything that Jeane Freeman and others are doing will minimise that risk. As always, we would remind you that the advice is wash your hands often and regularly and thoroughly. Use a tissue if you're coughing or sneezing. If you're exhibiting symptoms, contact the NHS on 111 as quickly as possible to see if you can get yourself tested, and try to avoid touching your face as well. That's one of the risk factors there. If you're travelling...
In relation to that, Kenny, that's why I'm sitting here with my arms folded, because I realise I'm terrible at regularly touching my face. So.
Yeah. Also, if you're travelling, then the Fit to Travel website, the NHS Fit to Travel website has a lot of good information, and also the NHS Inform website has useful information as well for anybody who's got concerns. In the meantime, obviously, if you don't have symptoms, don't panic. But if you have concerns, reach out to the NHS. They'd always rather answer a daft question than not answer a serious one that then causes you to get sick and transmit the disease. So just take care, and we can all do our bit to hopefully minimise the impact. But we move on now to the budget today, which normally would be the top story, but obviously with this outbreak happening, it's moved down a notch. But the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, delivered his first budget today after an exceptional delay caused by the failings of his predecessor Sajid Javid and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Notable moves included an increase in the threshold for paying national insurance contributions and the removal of VAT from period products, the so-called tampon tax. However, most of the budget was focused on a response to the coronavirus outbreak, including changes to statutory sick pay, employment support allowance for self-employed people, extra funding to the NHS and other public services across England to manage the crisis, and a loan scheme for businesses suffering interruptions to their work due to the virus. Responding to the UK budget, Scottish Finance Minister Kate Forbes said, "While I'm pleased to see the UK government's economic response to coronavirus following my calls for this at the UK Treasury yesterday, we need confirmation on what this will mean for Scotland. We require urgent clarification on what funding Scotland will receive from the announcements made by the UK Government, at a time when the prospects for the economy and public finances remain very uncertain as the short-term impacts of COVID-19 unfold. It is vital that our businesses, employees, health services and the most economically vulnerable in our society are all protected through this time, and this additional funding will help us in our response. Meanwhile, the Scottish Greens described the budget as dangerous after the Chancellor also announced large investments in road expansions and freezing fuel duty. The party's finance spokesperson and co-leader Patrick Harvie said, "This is a dangerous budget from a UK government which puts deregulated economic growth over people and planet. Much more should have been done to protect those with insecure pay and rent from coronavirus disruption, and there were no serious proposals to tackle the climate emergency." And the SNP's Westminster leader criticised the budget statement today as a sticking plaster that fails to reverse the decade of decline the Tory government has presided over. Ian Blackford said, "The Chancellor today had an opportunity to address and reverse a decade of decline and austerity that his government has presided over. He failed to do so. Instead, the Tories' economic agenda was merely a sticking plaster. If the Chancellor believes that this budget levels up after a decade of austerity and assault on people's livelihoods, then he is wrong. After inflicting years of cruel and deep cuts, the Tories are offering more of the same, while ushering in a new era of political and economic isolation outside the EU. The UK is not serving Scotland's interests." And Roger, I'm sure you'll agree with at least that very last line of Ian Blackford's comments. That's something that pretty much defines the independence movement. But what did you make of the budget today? Was there anything that jumped out at you as particularly positive or particularly negative?
Yes, I think the first thing that I would say that I think was very negative for Scotland that was sort of slipped in was that, as we know, in many parts of Scotland, many of our sectors such as agriculture, fish processing and the like are very dependent upon workers coming from what is now EU states, the 27, and the restrictions and immigration are going to pose a challenge. In the budget, however, this is made much more difficult. For example, if you're coming from the EU, say you're a couple with two of a young family coming to Scotland, in addition to the problems of getting in because of the immigration changes, you're going to be expected, because of this budget, to pay £2,200 every year to give you access to the NHS. So what's happening is there's a burden put on top of the restrictions we already know about, a financial burden put on top of people, and that's just going to deter people even further from coming in and playing their part constructively in the Scottish economy. So for me, that particular aspect is deserving of more comment. I think the other thing, if I was being slightly more positive about the budget, I think what we're getting for the first time is a recognition that really it's very restricted what the government can do through monetary policy alone. And you can see that with, despite the what is lauded as extreme measures by the Bank of England, the extreme measures are simply that they're able to reduce the interest rate by 50 basis points or 0.5%, and that they're introducing one or two other matters to try and encourage banks to loan to SMEs. But really on that side of things, it's very restricted what you can do. So there's a much greater reliance, understandably, on fiscal measures. What's going to be done by way of increased investment and the like. And I think on the one hand, although I would welcome increased investment, the big question is how far is Scotland going to have control of that? So, for example, Kate Forbes, I think, was right, if I recall her statement correctly, in saying what we need to know much more is how much of this much lauded money is going to come into the hands of the Scottish Government, who are going to be able to set their own priorities. For example, the last thing I would want to see is money diverted over the next few years into what I think is an absolutely ludicrous proposal to create a tunnel between Scotland and Northern Ireland at 20 billion. The opportunity cost that presents is huge. So that, for example, for less than that, we could invest in our ports and create export hubs that would really contribute to productivity improvement in Scotland and help prepare us for independence when we want to be in control of our own export policy. So for me, the critical thing is, how far is the Scottish Government going to have control over the decisions?
On that note, how seriously do you take this idea of a bridge or a tunnel to Ireland? Is it one of those things that has just been thrown out there to distract us from some of the other issues that the government in Westminster is not handling very well?
Well, in one sense, I hope it is just a ridiculous distraction, because I think that amount of investment, if placed into that one matter, would mean that you're denying that investment to much more productive areas. And so it would, in that sense, harm. It's like, as many economists would say, the real cost of anything is the opportunity cost. It's not so much the 20 billion that you're putting into a project.
Well, you're not spending that 20 billion.
You're not spending in other areas because of that. And so for me, I hope it is just a bit of PR that's going to die, and that the money, however, is going to be available for more effective decision making in Scotland.
And Kate Forbes also mentioned the kind of question of how much Scotland will receive in Barnett consequentials from this spending on coronavirus mitigation or management. How big an issue is it for the Scottish Government that they can't do what a normal country does and spend money and not necessarily worry about having that money in the bank to start with? The Scottish Government works on that fixed budget and has to wait until the Barnett consequentials come in before it can start to spend. How big an issue is that for when a crisis like this emerges?
It's absolutely huge. I mean, what it means is, if you're on a fixed budget in the way in which the Scottish Government is, it hugely restricts your ability to react to unforeseen events and emergencies, simply because you don't have, for example, the extent of borrowing powers that are needed. I mean, if you look at, although I've not been able to look at the red book that accompanies the budget statement, my understanding is the trajectory of borrowing is hugely increased. In other words, the Chancellor is paying for much of this through significant increased borrowing. Now, he can do that. Scottish Government doesn't have that lever. So that if we are going to respond in any similar way at all in terms of coronavirus, the Scottish Government can't do that by borrowing. They've got to be dependent upon getting Barnett consequentials. And what's not clear to me, at least, from the budget statement is how far the many proposals that are made in the budget, do they all carry Barnett consequentials or not? And what are the implications for Scotland? So I think this is a big question. It's going to have to be answered, hopefully, within hours, or certainly within a few days, to enable the Scottish Government to plan properly.
Yeah, it's the big question that Kate Forbes has been asking, and as you say, with this crisis to manage, it is one that we really do need answered as quickly as possible. We do have to move on now. We're in New York. Former Hollywood super producer Harvey Weinstein was sentenced to 23 years in prison in New York today. Weinstein, who also faces multiple charges in Los Angeles in a trial to be held shortly, was handed down his punishment by Judge James Burke at the New York Supreme Court, having been convicted on 2 counts of sexual assault. The judge imposed 20 years for a first-degree criminal sex act for forcing oral sex on a production assistant, Miriam Haley, in 2006. He also imposed a 3-year sentence for third-degree rape of another woman. The 2 sentences will run consecutively, meaning that Weinstein, 67, will have to complete the 20-year term before serving the rape sentence. Both the main accusers, as well as the 4 other main witnesses from the trial, came into court as a united group, sitting in the front row alongside Cyrus Vance, the DA of New York, who led the prosecution. The women were cheered as they walked into court. In a victim statement read out in court, Haley said that Weinstein not only stripped me of my dignity as a human being and as a woman, it diminished my confidence and faith in myself. She added that she felt alone as she was going through the trauma, with no idea that other women were out there who had similarly suffered abuse. In her statement, the rape victim, who is anonymous, said she had finally found her voice. It is time people who rape other people pay with their life and the life they took. Both main accusers asked the court to impose the maximum sentence. And Roger, this is one of the big cases that has emerged from the so-called Me Too movement. Harvey Weinstein was a man who had immense power in Hollywood. We all know stories about the casting couch in Hollywood. But this has really exposed to a lot of people just how seedy and dark that world can be. We know, of course, that it happens in all walks of life, in business, in politics, in whatever line of work. What's your feeling about this? Do you think this is going to be a kind of breakthrough moment, and we're going to begin to see more big names kind of brought down after years of silence?
I don't know. I'm not sure that it'll be a breakthrough moment because of the uniqueness of this case. I mean, it was unusual in terms of the scale and in terms of the prominence of the individual, and I'm not sure how far that the movement that has resulted before it, what its long-term consequences are going to be. I mean, I'm sure, like everybody else, including yourself, Kenny, our thoughts have to be at all times with the victims of this, and hopefully they feel that they've got justice from what has happened in the United States today. But it's very difficult to predict how far this is going to be a breakthrough moment.
Yeah. Do you think it's... what did you make of the sentence? Do you think that sounds appropriate? I mean, at 67 years old, Weinstein is not in the best of health. 23 years means he's overwhelmingly likely to die in jail. Do you think that's an appropriate sentence?
Yeah. Well, I'll put it this way. I think in the US, it will be seen as an appropriate sentence. What we've got to remember is the United States system provides much longer sentences for almost every type of criminal conviction compared with our own. But I think effectively, as you've said, I don't think the 23 years or whatever is what's critical here. Effectively, what has happened is he's been consigned to go to prison and to die in prison. And that's really the consequences, in my view, of what the sentence is today. So he's condemned never to walk the streets ever again as a free man. And that, I think, given what he has been convicted of and the way in which he acted, I would think most people will think that's appropriate.
Yeah. And of course, he still has, as I said, a number of charges to face in the Los Angeles trial, which will happen sometime soon. We're not exactly sure yet, but I'm sure we'll report on it when it happens. In other legal news, though, today, the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission has today again referred the case of the late Abdelbaset Ali Mohamed Al-Megrahi to the High Court of Justiciary for determination. As a result of the Commission's decision, Mr. Megrahi's family is now entitled to instruct an appeal against his conviction on the 31st of January 2001 for the murders of the 243 passengers and the 16 crew on board Pan Am Flight 103 from London to New York and 11 residents of Lockerbie on the 21st of December 1988. The Commission has sent a statement of reasons for its decision to the High Court, and it has sent a copy of the document to Messrs. Amar Anwar and Company, whom the Megrahi family have instructed, also to the Lord Advocate and to the Crown Agent. And this case, this is one of the most kind of complex and I don't want to celebrated isn't quite the word I want to use, but maybe notorious cases in recent Scottish legal history. There's been a number of people, including people in Lockerbie, who have long maintained that Al-Megrahi was not the perpetrator, that the case was not very strong. And now we're seeing, Alex Salmond previously, as First Minister, released Al-Megrahi on compassionate grounds when he was close to death and received a mountain of criticism, especially from the United States, for it. But there was always a feeling, I think, certainly amongst some people, that Al-Megrahi had been wrongly convicted. What do you make of this development now, some years after Megrahi has died?
To tell you the truth, I'm not the least bit surprised. I was 100% supportive of the early release from the Scottish Government of Megrahi. I've always had, and I'm speaking here not as a legal expert, but just looking at the details of the case as reported, I was very dubious that justice had fully been done.
There were questions about aspects of the evidence, but there was something, I don't have a note in front of me, about how the case had been constructed. What do you think about this general idea of kind of appealing on behalf of someone who has died? I mean, Megrahi is not going to get anything personally, is not going to get those years in jail back. What difference do you think it makes?
Sorry for interrupting you, Ken. Yeah. I mean, the point you make is correct. He's not going to get something back, but the system of justice is going to get something back. If I draw a parallel, for example, with the way in which Alan Turing and others had been convicted many, many years ago for acts which we consider which are now perfectly legal and perfectly appropriate. I mean, those matters have been cleared up. And so I think, although the individual might not achieve justice, if we assume for the moment he was innocent, justice benefits from doing the right thing.
Yeah. I've just been handed the press release from the Commission. And it says, a miscarriage of justice may have occurred because no reasonable trial court relying on the evidence laid at trial could have held the case against Mr. Megrahi was proved beyond reasonable doubt. I mean, sounds like a pretty damning, thing to say. And let me just see. Yeah, there's also an argument that he was denied a fair trial because certain aspects of it, certain pieces of evidence weren't disclosed to the defence. What do you think? What do you think that says about the process?
Well, this is the first I've heard those precise words, Kenny. But as you read them to me, it makes me even more convinced that it is highly likely there was a miscarriage of justice. And therefore, this has to be, I would have thought, pursued in the interests of justice and in the interests of doing something to salvage the reputation of those who have been involved on the right side of justice and on the right side of the law.
Yeah, as you say, even if there's nothing we can do to make up for what happened to Mr. Megrahi himself, that his family should know that if he was innocent, then they should have the right to know that and to have his good name restored. We will obviously follow up on that as and when we get news on the appeal itself. But also in court news, the Green MSP and land reform campaigner Andy Whiteman has won the defamation case brought against him by Wildcat Haven Enterprises. Whiteman had suggested in a blog post that the company was primarily engaged in tax evasion, not saving the Scottish wildcat. While the court ruled that some of Mr. Whiteman's claims were not true, they were also not defamatory, as no harm could be proved, and the inferences that the company's lawyers had said people would take from the blog were not meanings that the average reader would take from it. Responding to the judgment, Whiteman said, "I'm delighted with this judgment from Lord Clark. I would like to thank my legal team of Campbell, Dean and Roddy Dunlop QC for their support, diligence and hard work over the past 3 years. I'd also like to thank my family and colleagues at work for their support and understanding over this period. I want to pay particular thanks to the thousands of people who generously contributed to my crowdfunder, without whom I would simply have been unable to defend myself. I have been hugely encouraged by their ongoing support. And this kind of case, even though what Wightman said wasn't strictly true, the threat of defamation, this was a £750,000 action that was taken. The cost of going to court, the cost of defending yourself in court on a defamation charge can be incredibly expensive. And for all, Andy Wightman makes a decent salary as an MSP. He's not vastly wealthy. What do you think this says about the law in Scotland, and how do you feel about defamation reform?
I certainly think that the cost of justice in Scotland is far too high in many types of cases, including in this one. Could I just say, at a personal level, I'm absolutely delighted for Andy Wightman. I think on the whole, his career has been one of trying to do the right thing, of trying to raise issues of injustice in many aspects, and particularly, of course, in the environmental field. So I'm personally very pleased for Andy and wish him well in the future. I think what it exposes, however, you're very right, Kenny, to say that had it not been for the many people who had contributed to a crowdfunder, Andy would not have been able to defend himself. And the problem we've got is that a lot of corporate organisations have considerable wealth, and the mere threat of taking action is one that gives them undue influence in terms of justice and makes it easier for them to achieve the outcome they want at the expense of more modest means individuals and organisations. So I hope that in time it will be possible to review this whole system.
Yeah, there has been talk of defamation reform in Scotland for a number of years. There's been some reform in England recently, which has been welcomed by free speech campaigners and journalism, the PEN campaign and all these other groups. What do you think is the hold-up in Scotland over this?
I don't know exactly, but it's obviously going to have cost implications, because any action involves costs, and if you're going to reduce the cost of access to justice for large numbers of people, somebody's got to pick up the bill, as it were. And so there are cost implications. I don't know exactly what the level of cost implications would be, but I think it's something that has to be looked at.
Yeah, and what are your thoughts on, for example, MPs and MSPs having a level of immunity on this? Obviously, there's immunity for privilege in Parliament, but for things said outside Parliament, do you think there's a place for that kind of thing?
I'm very dubious about that. I think there is sufficient protection. I used to be a member of Parliament. When I was a member of Parliament, I never felt at any time the need to have any greater privilege than the average person. And so I'm very dubious about giving that to the political class.
Mm-hmm. But
on the other hand, what I would say is, I think there is a need much more strongly in our society today to protect free speech and to see that in itself as an important feature of society. Yeah. There are far too many debates, far too many political debates going on, I think, in society, where people get booed down, people get prevented from giving their views. And I think that's an extraordinarily unhelpful thing for democratic society. So I think what we need to do is we need to look at ways in which we protect appropriate free speech for everybody, so that we can have a healthy democracy. If you close down free speech, it leads to a very unhealthy state of affairs.
Yeah, and of course this was a blog post. This wasn't an article in a newspaper. Newspapers have lawyers kind of on retainer. Controversial stories that are potentially controversial will get legaled, where a lawyer will go through the story and decide whether it's fit for publication. Do you think there's scope for maybe different rules to be applied to a blogger or even a Twitter account, which can in some cases be defamatory, as opposed to things like newspapers or large broadcast organisations like, say, the BBC?
Yeah. Well, what I would say is I think this goes beyond a mere existing type of law. When you mention things like Twitter and social media, these are relatively recent phenomenon. And on the one hand, they are seen by people as extending the rights to free speech. But on the other hand, it increases the amount of abuse, unreasonable abuse that many people have to suffer from. So my view would be, rather than suggesting any particular legal resolution at the moment, what I would like to see is a much wider inquiry into how in the modern world do we balance the rights of people to have free speech, but on the other hand, respect the rights of people to be free from ridiculous abuse. Yeah. So I think it's a complex question that relates to the nature of the modern world, modern communication, and we need to have a fairly broad and very thorough look at this.
Yeah, it's all a very, very complex issue. We've had issues here with claims against certain broadcasts that we've made, and all of these issues about how we publish, how copyright works online, how defamation works in the social media age, are all big issues. I think you're quite right. We need to have a much bigger conversation about all of it.
Absolutely.
Moving on now, though, to some other court news. The trial of former First Minister Alex Salmond continued today at the High Court in Edinburgh. Woman H, giving evidence for a third day, denied suggestions by the defence that she had consented to a sexual encounter with Salmond, saying that she had never been a willing participant and never would be. Following her testimony, 3 defence witnesses were called out of sequence with the agreement of the prosecution. These included a police officer speaking about a video of an interview with the celebrity who attended dinner at Bute House on the night of the alleged assault of Woman H. The celebrity said that Woman H and Salmond were still in the building when he left, but that the 4 people in attendance at the dinner had shared just 1 bottle of wine and that nobody was significantly under the influence. A businessman then testified that he had attended numerous events at Bute House and had seen Woman H and Alex Salmond appearing friendly and comfortable together. Finally, a member of staff at Yes Scotland told the court that Woman H had never even mentioned dinner with the celebrity in conversations with him. Following this, the prosecution led evidence from Woman A and Woman C. Woman A said that Salmond was prone to giving her sloppy kisses on the lips, as well as often touching her inappropriately, including in public places. Defence lawyer Gordon Jackson QC put it to her that she was exaggerating the significance of such events, noting that Salmond often kissed members of the public. He also put it to Woman A that she had encouraged other women to bring forward complaints against Salmond in an attempt to turn trivial things into criminal charges. Woman A denied all of this. Woman C then described being in the back of the First Minister's ministerial car while her husband sat in the front seat, when Salmond placed his hand on her thigh. When Jackson asked her why she had not made a complaint about this alleged incident at the time, Woman C answered that Salmond was very important to the party and it seemed better to just put the incident to one side. The trial, which is expected to last for 4 weeks, continues. And in the United States, Democratic presidential contender Bernie Sanders has said he plans to stay in the White House race despite suffering losses in key states to frontrunner Joe Biden in yesterday's Democratic primaries. Biden, the former vice president, scored decisive primary victories in Michigan and 3 other states yesterday taking a big step towards the party's nomination to take on Republican Donald Trump in November and casting doubt on the future of Sanders' White House bid. Sanders, who won in North Dakota but had hoped for an upset victory in Michigan to boost his flagging chances, was forced to cancel an election night rally in Cleveland due to concerns over coronavirus and has yet to comment publicly on the results. Biden, who is 77, has already begun to look ahead to the general election, calling for party unity and making an appeal to supporters of Sanders, who is 78. "We share a common goal, and together we are going to defeat Donald Trump," Biden said in Philadelphia, thanking Sanders and his supporters for their energy and passion. Just 2 weeks ago, Sanders was seen as the frontrunner after an impressive win in Nevada in mid-February, while Biden and the other moderate candidates continued to split the vote of the party's centrists. But Biden has scored a series of victories since and has such momentum that Andrew Yang, the former candidate and now CNN pundit, described his chances as prohibitive and gave Biden his endorsement live on air yesterday evening as results were still coming in. Roger, I don't know how closely you've been following the American elections. What do you make of this comeback that Joe Biden has made after his rough results in the first three primaries and now winning the majority of states reasonably comfortably since then?
I believe it or not, I've been following US elections since 1960, although I know that that's hard to believe looking at how young I am.
Oh, obviously,
but,
yes.
But yes, I've been keeping an eye on this. In actual fact, my take on this would be slightly different from the one which you proposed, Kenny, and it's this. I think far too much was made of the first couple of days of primaries. Relatively small ones, and you know, so from that point of view, I always thought that Joe Biden was the front runner. I've always thought Joe Biden's weakness is that he's pretty gaffe prone,
yeah,
to say the least. But he seems to have been pretty well cocooned in the last few weeks in that regard. So, you know, my expectation would be that unless he makes one or two of his famed gaffes, I think it looks very much like he's headed towards getting the Democratic nomination.
Yeah, there is going to be another debate this week, which a lot of people on the Sanders camp were hoping for a debate immediately after South Carolina, before Super Tuesday. They had hoped that Sanders might be able to halt some of that Biden momentum there. This debate that's happening this week now is not going to be a head-to-head debate. It's going to be more like two town hall things. And there's apparently going to be no audience present because of the coronavirus issue.
An unusual town hall debate then.
Yeah, it seems a little odd, but I think there's going to be a panel of interviewers somewhat similar to the other debates. What is it about Joe Biden, you think, that even with these continual gaffes, including one this week where he threatened to slap a union worker who was asking about his position on Second Amendment rights. Yeah. He's been rude to a number of people. He's been quite short-tempered. He's been forgetting his lines, slipping up on words. Said his wife was his sister at one event the other week. What do you think it is about Joe Biden that is just so strong in comparison to Bernie Sanders, who had such a strong performance in 2016 and has seemed to have only built his organization since then?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I would say is the recent gaffes that you've mentioned are, in terms of the Biden history, relatively small scale. Right? There's that. I think what there is there's a kind of incumbent effect because he was a previous vice president and has got a lot of the mainstream centrist in the Democratic Party rooting for him. So I think from that point of view, he's got advantages in the way in which Sanders doesn't. And what we've also got to remember is Sanders is not a lifelong Democrat. For most of his career in politics, he's operated as an independent, and it's only in relatively recent times that he's formally joined the Democratic fold. Whereas Biden has got a lifetime in Democratic politics behind him. So I think there is a form of incumbent effect that is to his advantage. I think secondly, what there'll be people presumably will be thinking about is who's going to be best to take on Donald Trump and who has the potential to win. Now, whether those, for example, in the left in this country like it or not, unfortunately, the profile in America is such that it's quite difficult to see how Sanders would be able to put together the scale of coalition that would be necessary to beat Trump, at least as we understand what Trump's strength is at the moment. So I think he's got an uphill struggle to defeat Biden at the moment, would be my reading of the situation.
Yeah, and what's your feeling about Biden's chances against Trump?
I wish I felt they were higher.
Yeah,
you know, I'm genuinely concerned, as I think a lot of people would, about that. So that if he does become the Democratic nominee, I would certainly be hoping he would beat Trump, but I'm a bit concerned about whether he will be able to at the current time.
Yeah. Do you think his choice of vice president can make a big difference there? And do you have any idea who he might have his eye on?
I've got absolutely no idea who he's got his eye on. Presumably it would have to be somebody who's younger. I think it would make a lot of sense that it's a woman, perhaps one of the women that has been running for nomination. The other thing you've got to remember about American politics is not just who you want to pick, it's who's willing to come on your ticket with you. So in that regard, although I think it'd probably be wise to be a younger woman who's very good in front of the media and not so prone to gaffes and the like, I think that would help him a lot. But who that might be, don't know.
Yeah, well, I think he does now have the endorsement of every candidate or every major candidate that's dropped out, with the exception of Mike Gravel. So it does look like he would have his pick of those at least. But anyway, we will move on. We'll discuss the American elections more as we get more results in over the coming weeks, I'm sure. But back in Scotland, more than 5,000 people have submitted objections to Ministry of Defence plans to increase the volume of radioactive waste dumped into the Gairloch, thanks to a campaign by local Scottish Green MSP Ross Greer. The MOD is seeking approval to significantly increase the volume of radioactive waste it dumps into Scottish waters. At the core of these plans is an intention to build a new nuclear support hub at Faslane Naval Base in order to more than double the number of nuclear submarines based there. This would see the Faslane base pump more radioactive waste into the natural environment at the Gairloch. The MOD's application outlines expected discharges of up to 52 times more radioactive cobalt-60 and up to 30 times more radioactive tritium than at present. Mr. Greer raised the matter in Parliament this afternoon, demanding that the Scottish Government explain why they responded to the consultation but did not object. Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Rosanna Cunningham, refused to answer directly. Ross Greer MSP said, "I'm stunned that an SNP government which opposes the President's presence of nuclear weapons at Faslane is not willing to stand up to Westminster plans to massively increase the volume of radioactive waste those submarines are dumping into Scottish waters. That is the opposite of standing up for Scotland." So these proposals came up some weeks ago. What's your take on this idea of expanding the operations at Faslane and increasing the amount of radioactive waste going into the water?
Well, I've got to declare an interest here. And my interest is as far back as the 1970s. I was a campaigner against the threatened dumping of nuclear waste in Mulhawker. in the southwest of Scotland. And ever since then, I have been against it. Indeed, I remember at one time I was asked by Alex Salmond when I was in Vienna to go along and hand in a letter and complain about the threatened shipping of waste, would you believe, from Iraq to Dounreay. So for my whole political career, I have been against using Scotland as a dump for nuclear waste, and I continue to be opposed to that. So I would have every sympathy with those who are campaigning to prevent such dumping.
And what do you think the chances are of this campaign that Ross Greer is leading having any impact? That's 5,000 people objecting to it. Do you think the Westminster government will be listening?
I don't think the Westminster government will be listening at the moment. But what I would say is people must never give up in their campaigns. It's remarkable what can happen. So for example, if I go back as far as the 1970s, eventually the campaign in some respects was quite successful in relation to the southwest of Scotland. And there's been other campaigns that have been successful. And so that I think what will happen is people have to keep campaigning. I think there is a great difficulty because of the attitude of the current government and the fact that the current government has such a substantial majority. So it is not going to be easy, but I would certainly encourage them to keep going.
Yeah, and what more do you think the Scottish Government can do? I mean, they have responsibility for the environment, for the quality of our water and things like that, quality of our natural environment. What more can they do to challenge the Westminster Government over this?
Well, of course, what we don't know is what's happening behind the scenes by way of private discussions, which often go on in these matters. And, it could well be that the Scottish Government have decided on balance at the moment not to make all of their conversations as yet public. That's mere speculation in my part, I don't know. But I certainly would hope that the Scottish Government look very seriously at this matter and what the long-term consequences would be if they decide not to fight this proposal strongly.
Yeah. Well, we do just have one more story tonight, and this is some good news in North Ayrshire. North Ayrshire Council has been awarded £400,000 to develop tourism across Ayrshire's island and coastal destinations. The COIG, that's the Gaelic for five, touring route initiative will provide the west coast of Scotland, the Firth of Clyde and Islands with a new opportunity to brand and promote itself to national and international visitors. The funding will complement the region's tourism strategy, Making Waves, and support further development and promotion of Ayrshire through support for events. Marine and coastal tourism is a key part of Scotland's tourism sector, providing employment for 28,300 people across the country. 2020 has been designated as the Year of Coasts and Waters, organised to inspire responsible engagement and inclusive participation from visitors and locals, and encourage them to experience all that Scotland's shores have to offer. Speaking at the Sail Scotland conference in West Kilbride, Economy Secretary Fiona Hislop said, "The marine tourism sector makes an enormous contribution to Scotland's tourism industry and all it has to offer, and this £400,000 investment will raise the profile of Ayrshire as a major player in tourism. We have already invested £770,000 to support the Year of Coasts and Waters events across the country, showcasing and celebrating all that Scotland's coasts, seas, rivers, lochs and canals have to offer. We want to support businesses involved in tourism to make the most of the opportunities they create, ensuring they are sustainable and making a positive impact on the environment, society and economy." And this surely has to be good news for Ayrshire. What do you make of this then, Roger?
Well, I'm absolutely delighted at this move, and I'm delighted that the Scottish Government support. And I say this, of course, because I'm an Ayrshire boy originally, born in Maybole, and in my early years spent a lot of time in the beautiful coastline of Ayrshire. So I think this is an initiative to be very strongly welcomed.
Yeah, I'm a great fan of the Ayrshire coast myself as well. If anyone's watching that's never spent much time down there, we do strongly recommend it. It's in fact where Broadcasting Scotland was born, so you know, lots of good things come from Ayrshire. So anyway, that is all we've got time for tonight. I'd like to thank our guest Roger Mullen very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have him, always great insights to offer as well. Thank you for joining us as well. As always, we would like to ask you, if you're able to support Broadcasting Scotland, if you're able to, please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up as a supporter. Your £5 a month can make a huge difference to what Broadcasting Scotland is able to do. It costs a lot of money just to keep the lights on in even a small studio like this, and every penny that you give us helps us produce more, better and different types of programmes. Broadcasting Scotland wants to be the independent broadcaster that Scotland deserves, and we can only do that with your support. If you're not able to support us financially, don't feel bad about it. The shows will always be free to view online, and we welcome you as a viewer above all else. That's the big thing. But you can still help us by being our publicity team. We don't have a marketing budget here, so we rely on our viewers to spread the word about what we're doing. So do please follow us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot. Find us on Facebook just by searching Broadcasting Scotland. And share the shows with your friends, your family, anybody you think that might be interested in some of the stories that we talk about here. If there's anything that you think we've talked about that's been interesting, do mention about it, talk about it on social media, talk about it to your pals down the pub or wherever you go. Let them know who we are, what we are and why we are, because without you we can't spread the word terribly widely. And finally, I've mentioned this a couple of times in the last couple of weeks. I'm going for surgery first thing tomorrow morning, so I'm not going to be here for a wee while. And that means that we need more people who can help out here at Broadcasting Scotland in some of the work that needs to be done here, whether that's journalism, in producing, writing up the stories, whether it's working in production on the control desk, cutting between the shots you see here, or whether it's working behind the cameras, working on sound. We have an outside broadcast unit that we'd love to make more use of, but again, we need more people trained up on how to use it. Whatever, and as well, as I say, I'm not going to be here for a wee while, and Gordon's not going to be able to cover every night. So we're always looking for new hosts as well, so that the people like Gordon and me can get a wee break now and again. So if you're able to help in any way like that, please do let us know, whether you have skills already that you think you can contribute, or whether you want to learn, or you want to get a foot in the door of the broadcasting industry. We have professional standard equipment here, and it's a great place to learn. We can offer all kinds of training if that's something that you want to learn about. So if you or somebody you know is interested in getting into broadcasting, there is not a better place you could start, because we have no barriers to entry. You literally just need to show up and we'll find something for you to do. As I say, I'm going for this surgery, so if you're of that persuasion, then please say a wee prayer for me. If not, then send me some good karma or something. But until I do return, Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7. I will be back sometime in a couple of weeks, hopefully once my knee is all better. But until then, have a great night. Thanks very much. Good night.